What if a single, remarkably simple, practice handed down in hidden teachings and echoed in ancient Egyptian symbolism was the key that allowed certain initiates to open a door in perception that most of us walk past every day? According to a strand of Gnostic writings and a number of modern esoteric interpreters, there was a technique, subtle and low-tech, that trained the eye and the mind to permit what had been filtered away to come into view. If you feel a pull toward that possibility, or if you have ever suspected there is more to what we call seeing than meets the eye, stay with me. If you're ready to try this responsibly, type ready in the comments and let this be the start of a careful experiment. The pieces of this puzzle arrive from unlikely places. In the mid-20th century, codices unearthed at Nag Hammadi brought to light texts that had been largely invisible to mainstream history for centuries. Among them, the Gospel of Mary and other Gnostic writings preserve teachings that some interpreters read as instructions for a kind of inner vision, practices aimed at perceiving realities that ordinary perception overlooks. These are not canonical New Testament documents. They belong to a different stream of early Christian and extra-canonical reflection. That qualification matters because what follows is an attempt at synthesis, a bridge between those Gnostic claims, the rich symbolic language of ancient Egypt about vision and the eye, and a practical perceptual method preserved by initiatory cultures and revived by contemporary practitioners. Ancient Egypt is full of eye imagery symbols that point towards seeing beyond the surface, the wedged eye, the idea of an inner gaze, and ritual practices designed to align the knower with hidden orders. Many modern esoteric teachers, and some comparative historians, suggest that those symbols encode methods of attention, not merely metaphors. Read together. The Nag Hammadi texts and Egyptian iconography create an interpretive picture, a tradition concerned with training perception so that certain subtle presences, what Gnostic authors called archons, or in other mythic language, shadowy feeders on inattention, could be recognized and thereby lose their power. Again, this is an interpretive reading, not a claim of documentary proof. It's a hypothesis worth testing in lived experience. Why would anything that moves among us remain unseen? The answer proposed by these traditions is deceptively simple. Our perceptual system filters out a vast amount of input so that we can function. Central vision gives us focused detail. Peripheral vision provides motion and context, but at lower resolution. The brain builds a coherent scene by selecting what is relevant and discarding what it judges as noise. Esoteric authors and many contemporary perceptual teachers suggest that this selection process also excludes whole classes of subtle phenomena. These invisible influences, described in Gnostic language as archons, function by staying beyond the threshold of ordinary attention. They feed on distraction and emotional reactivity. Invisibility is their main tactic because what cannot be seen cannot be named, and what cannot be named exerts unchallenged influence. Framing the problem like this gives us a practical hypothesis. If invisibility depends on the way attention is habitually deployed, then altering attention might reveal what was previously hidden. The technique at the heart of this message is simple in form and rich in consequence. A soft, unfocused gaze practiced in low light with an expanded peripheral awareness. It is not a dramatic trance, a pharmacological shortcut, or a ritual of exorcism. It is a training of the visual and attentional systems to permit different frequencies of information to rise into consciousness. To try it responsibly, create a safe setting. Sit comfortably, not slumped, with your spine supported and your shoulders relaxed. Choose a dimly lit room, enough light that the objects around you are silhouettes rather than vivid color, but not so dark that you strain. Neutral background is best. A plain wall, a curtain, or a space with soft textures will reduce visual clutter that tempts the central focus. Avoid mirrors during initial sessions and do not practice if you are in a state of acute emotional crisis or under the care of a mental health professional who has asked you not to engage in perceptual experiments. If you have a history of psychosis, hallucination, or severe dissociation, do not use this technique without professional guidance. Begin by centering your attention on the breath for a few cycles. Notice the in and out without changing it. Then allow your eyes to rest on a neutral point in front of you, but do not fixate. The key word is soften. Instead of staring, unfocus slightly. Let the edge of your visual field come into gentle play. You will feel this as a loosening, not as a strain. Let your eyelids be relaxed. The gaze is open, but not intense. As you maintain this soft gaze, shift your attention outward from the central spot into your periphery. Imagine your awareness as a wide, shallow bowl that catches everything within its rim rather than a pinhole spotlight searching for a target. Hold this posture for about 10 minutes to start. Many practitioners treat 10 minutes a day for a week as an experiential benchmark. That the first subtle shifts often appear within that time frame, yet other practitioners only notice change after several weeks. There is no fixed guarantee. Treat these numbers as orientation, not promise. What is it you might notice? Reports from those experimenting with this approach tend to cluster around a few poetic but consistent themes. Subtle distortions at the edges of vision, like static or smoke that moves with unusual autonomy. Quick, semi-transparent figures that seem to be made of shifting light. Sudden, inexplicable flickers of motion that stop when you try to scrutinize them with a central gaze. Crucially, practitioners emphasize responsiveness as the test that separates imagination from a possible perceptual contact. If what you perceive reacts to your attention, changing shape, withdrawing, or otherwise altering upon being observed, that reaction is a primary clue. Many people describe a sense of presence that recalibrates when met by attention. Others report emotional shifts, a feeling of being unhooked from a mood that had seemed rooted in themselves. These are the anecdotal markers that Gnostic writers framed as the moment the veil thinned. How should you respond if something moves in your peripheral field? First, do not panic. The practice is not about confrontation but about seeing. The initial instruction is to observe without aggression. Notice qualities: shape, motion, temperature, feel in your body, and whether the form retreats or intensifies when you meet it with attention. If a reaction is presentive, something visibly adjusts to your observation, you can test further with a calm mental assertion. A simple inward statement such as, you are known here, or the thought, I do not feed. This is sufficient for many. Some people find that verbally naming the observations, softly saying, I see you, aloud creates an immediate shift. Others prefer a silent, steadying breath and the visualization of a small light in the center of the chest or forehead. The goal is not to attack or to dramatize. It is to apply the principle that visibility diminishes the leverage of invisible influence. The entities described in the sources often rely on being ignored, dramatized, or projected upon. Recognition strips them of one of their fuel sources. Along with observational protocols, practitioners learn to identify what Gnostic literature calls anchors or points of connection objects, habitual thought patterns, emotional triggers, or symbolic knots that keep a subtle influence tethered to a person or place. When you encounter a persistent pattern of disturbance, repetitive intrusive thoughts with an uncanny quality, or sudden surges of mood that feel attached to no present cause, a careful, non-violent method of disentangling may be applied. Rather than dramatic ritual, most contemporary teachers advise simple, embodied measures. Maintain your soft gaze, bring steady attention to the felt sense of the anchor, breathe, and imagine the tether loosening as you gently move your attention away until the felt pull dissipates. Visualize the connection as a rope of light that becomes thin and dissolves under your steady, non-reactive awareness. If an anchor involves a physical object, remove it from your immediate space and observe whether the pattern shifts. Always keep interventions proportionate and psychologically grounded. If a practice causes anxiety, stop and seek professional support. It's important to underline an epistemic test that repeatedly appears in both the ancient texts and modern reports. The asymmetry of reaction. Imagined forms created by the mind typically remain indifferent to scrutiny. They persist when probed and often invite embellishment. Perceptual contacts described by experimental practitioners tend to respond to attention, sometimes by fleeing, sometimes by reconfiguring, sometimes by entering a stilled, watchful posture. That responsiveness is not definitive proof. Perception is complex and suggestible, but it is a practical heuristic that helps distinguish habitual fantasy from phenomena that display an apparent agency. Now we must carefully address the link that gives this message its provocative title: the connection to the pineal gland and to ancient Egypt. The pineal is a small gland deep in the brain that many mystical traditions have long associated with the third eye. Esoteric interpreters, drawing from comparative symbols and ritual descriptions, often read Egyptian eye symbols as a pointer to inner-seeing mechanisms rather than literal ocular anatomy. Some modern teachers suggest that practices like the soft gaze engage neural circuits that involve the pineal's regulatory neighborhood, creating a felt sense of opening that maps onto bygone metaphors of the third eye. Again, this is a synthesis, an interpretive bridge. We are not claiming archaeological proof that every Egyptian initiate manipulated a gland. Rather, we are proposing that the repeated cross-cultural emphasis on an inner eye may point to convergent techniques aimed at altering attention and perception. When Gnostic texts such as the material found at Nag Hammadi speak about teachings that enable seeing beyond, they do so in language that modern readers often translate as visionary training. In the Gospel of Mary and related writings, the theme is liberation through knowledge gnosis that allows one to recognize how unseen forces shape human life. Gnostic authors describe entities and mechanisms with names like archons and the demiurge. These are mythic frameworks to make sense of psychological and perceptual phenomena. Many contemporary esoteric teachers read these frameworks as metaphors or as literal descriptions of subtle intelligences. Interpreters who connect these ideas to Egyptian eye symbolism argue that an ancient concern with inner sight persisted across cultures, a consistent motive to train attention in order to see and name what manipulates us. A final, practical caution before we close: these techniques are tools of perception and must be handled with care. They are not substitutes for medical or psychiatric treatment. If at any moment you feel overwhelmed, frightened, or stop the practice and reach out to a healthcare professional or a trusted support network. If you have a history of dissociation, psychosis, or mania, discuss any experimental perceptual work with your clinician. The goal is to recover a grounded awareness, not to chase visions at the cost of your well-being. In the historical record, many teachings were guarded precisely because they can unmoor unprepared individuals. Modern revivalists often understate that responsibility, approach with humility, curiosity, and responsibility. What changes when this skill begins to operate? Practitioners describe a subtle reconfiguration of agency. If a persistent pattern was being fed by something unseen, emotional mood that returned like clockwork, an impulse that felt alien, bringing attention to it often reduces its grip. The shadowy presence loses its ease. When a form is met and acknowledged rather than fed through reaction, it tends to diminish or to reveal its structure. For many, this means a newfound capacity to interrupt patterns that once felt inevitable, automatic outbursts, panic spirals, or recurring manipulative dynamics in a relationship. This is not mystical omnipotence. It is a practice-based regain of attention and naming that can alter the quality of one's interior landscape. There are ethical dimensions embedded here as well. Seeing is a responsibility. If visibility strips a hidden influence of power, then recognition carries the duty to respond with compassion and discernment rather than cruelty. Gnostic traditions emphasize inner liberation, not domination. The aim is to disentangle, to heal, to reclaim the sovereignty of one's attention. Practitioners who approach this work with arrogance or a desire to control are most likely to create ethical problems. Respect for others, autonomy, and for one's own psychological limits must guide every experiment. If you decide to try the practice, remember the practical rhythm. Prepare a safe environment, sit comfortably, soften your gaze in low light, expand attention into the periphery, hold for 10 minutes as a starting point, and repeat daily while tracking changes. Use the responsiveness heuristic to evaluate unusual perceptions. Keep a simple journal noting date, duration, what you've noticed, and how your body felt. If you notice increasing distress, stop and consult. Share observations with a trusted peer or guide who is versed in contemplative practices and psychological safety. Why does this matter beyond curiosity? Because the capacity to see, literally and metaphorically, changes power dynamics. Visibility converts manipulative influence into a phenomenon that can be named, troubled, and transformed. Whether one accepts the mythic language of archons and demiurge, or prefers a psychological frame of unconscious patterns, the operative insight remains. Attention is power. The ancient technique described in Gnostic fragments and mirrored in symbolic eyes across cultures is, at its core, a technology of attention, a disciplined way of turning the light of awareness into a tool for liberation. Reading the fragments from Nag Hammadi alongside Egyptian motifs and contemporary practice is a speculative, interpretive act, but it is one that yields a practical experiment anyone can perform. In closing, treat this as an invitation rather than a command. Experiment gently. Honor your limits. If you try the soft gaze practice, be patient with the timeline and generous with your curiosity. Many report small shifts within a few sessions and deeper changes over weeks. Others report no perceptual novelty but still find that their emotional reactivity calms under sustained practice. Whatever your result, the act of practicing attentive, non-reactive visibility changes the interior climate in ways that are usually beneficial. If this message resonated, share your experience below and tell us whether you felt any subtle shifts, how many days it took, and what you noticed. Subscribe if you want more explorations of ancient techniques, esoteric readings, and careful, responsible experiments in perception. Above all, practice with care, keep your feet on the ground, and remember that the most ancient initiations were as much about learning to hold compassion for what you see as they were about learning to see in the first place.